Dear listeners, welcome to Mark's Morning Call, real time, real markets.
Good morning. Today we have a very special session, and we're going to focus and look at some key elements of the energy sector, which you're aware has cropped up in various guises, particularly as it relates to AI and its significance in the investment environment right now. And rather than listening to me today, I'm absolutely delighted to have an old colleague of mine, Joseph Jacobelli. We worked together at HSBC in Hong Kong many years ago, where he was running the regional energy team, not just covering Hong Kong, but the whole of the Asian region. But the great thing about Joseph, I think, from your perspective, is just the rich expanse of his experience, both in terms of his passion for and knowledge of the energy industry, its fossil fuel, more importantly, climate awareness and the energy transition, but also he's an expert on finance as well. As an analyst at HSBC and various other investment banks, now running a family office. You'll also be pleased to know that he's published a book, and a new one, Powering the Unstoppable Green Shift, is due to be published next year. In addition, he's a multilinguist and really can bring so much kind of richness, I think, to today's session. So welcome, Joseph. Lovely to have you on the Invest Up Challenge podcast.
Thank you so much for the most kind introduction, Mark, and very happy to be part of this podcast. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Not at all. Look, one of the things that we've been talking about in the class session in particular is obviously AI and data centers. One of the things that keeps jumping out, and I guess in the first instance, a great shock to me, was that one of the limiting factors and key components is just the energy demands. Why do these data centers demand so much energy?
The simple answer is really they need a lot of computing power. Data centers in general need a lot of computing power. And then with AI, you even need more computing power. And you may, for those of you who use some of the ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever is your favorite AI engine, you'll know that there's something about tokens. And one query is X number of tokens. The more complicated the query, the more tokens. So each time you have these tokens, that's more computing power. We already so we're seeing a major growth in data centers per se. But then with the advent of AI, and I guess AI is particularly taken off in the last couple of years, you even need more computing power. So you're seeing a lot of the big names, whether it's Amazon, Google, Microsoft, etc., actually accelerating the number of data centers that they're putting up. And maybe I can give you a couple of numbers if you want about
Yeah,
data
we always
centers.
love numbers on Invest Up Challenge.
Okay. AI-related data centers actually require what could be called a staggering amount of capital investments over the next few years. There's several numbers around. One of them is from McKinsey, and they've got a report out. You can just Google it. They calculated that the amount between 2025 and 2030, will be somewhere between $3.7 trillion and $7.9 trillion. Now, two things about these numbers. Number one, they're huge, even the low end. And number two, why such a wide range? Because they adopted three different scenarios. One that they call the constrained momentum. So, it's growing, but not growing very, very fast. And the second scenario is a continued momentum, so it's growing a little bit faster, and then there's an accelerated demand kind of scenario. On the accelerated demand scenario, we are looking at something along the lines of almost $8 trillion to be invested globally. Now, these numbers, given I'm a former analyst, never take the numbers from one source, right, Mark?
Indeed.
We double check it. So I looked at some of the numbers from Knight Franks, the global real estate consultancy, as well as the IEA, the International Energy Agency, and they come up with scenarios of $4 to $6 trillion between 2025 and 2030. So that's the total amount that we're talking about. So where is this money going? I'm sure you want to know.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the great mysteries is also kind of what actually constitutes, what are the component parts of that?
Right.
Frankly, whether it's 4 trillion or 7 trillion, I mean, whichever way you cut it, it is a very, very large sum of money. I told the students before, I mean, the GDP of the UK is 2.5 trillion. So we're talking about a multiple of the entire GDP of a major economy.
Exactly. So if we take the high end scenario, Mark, which
Yeah.
is the 7.9 trillion, almost 8 trillion. So around about 2.6 trillion will be in the actual data center infrastructure. And that these data centers are originally they looked for really isolated places where land is cheap and you're not really disturbing anybody. You can get permitting very quickly. But now
Yeah.
increasingly you also get them, believe it or not, in the middle of cities. For example, Madrid, in some suburbs, are building data centers just because they want to be closer to the demand. So 2.6 trillion of that 7.9 trillion on the actual data center infrastructure. Then there's a big major chunk, which is 4.7 trillion going into the actual IT equipment. So these are the servers mostly, right? And then relatively small is the power generation attached to these data centers, which amounts to about zero point 0.6 billion. So it's the 600 billion.
Mere 600 billion.
Just tiny, a rounding error, a small rounding error. So now the question is, how much power will be needed? Because you've got two kind of things happening at the same time. One is you're increasing the number of data centers, so therefore you will need more electricity to serve these data centers. At the same time, these data centers are becoming increasingly more energy efficient because obviously, the guys building them not stupid. They're going to say, well, we don't want all of our profits to go and going to electricity. So what can we do, especially for cooling? Because keeping the temperature at a steady level is absolutely key. So a lot of the electricity is going for the cooling of the computers. And again, going back to your first question, which is what exactly is happening in the data centers? Well, they're doing a lot of computing, and there's a lot of computing power. The more computing power, the more the more hot the computers are going to get in the data center, and
Yeah.
so you need the cooling. Looking at the actual demand, to give you an idea, here I'm going to talk about terawatt hours. To give you a rough idea, in Japan, the annual electricity demand, Japan again being a major economy, is around about
Yeah.
1,000 terawatt hours. Right now, globally, data centers are estimated to consume around about 450 terawatt hours. And
Right.
depending on which scenario you're looking at, it's going to double or triple. So the good news is that in the global scheme of things, we're talking about by 2030, data centers and AI probably using something between 3 to 5%, maybe as much as 6% of global power. That's the good news. So it's not small, but it's not massive, right?
Okay.
But you've got this incremental increase, and this incremental increase is especially happening in developed economies. Now, the difference between developed economies and developing economies, in developing economies, you're still building out your electricity infrastructure. Whereas in developed countries, we're pretty much there. And really, what we're doing is, maybe closing down a coal fired power plant and replacing it with something else because electricity demand in developed economies is not growing that fast. We're talking about low single digits, where in developing countries it's going to be, maybe as much as middle single digits, or even high single digits. So there's a little bit of an issue, as you may guess, right? Because all of a sudden you're going from a relatively stable and predictable electricity demand in North
Yeah.
America, in Europe, to all of a sudden a blip. And how you're going to be, how you're going to be addressing that? And that's a major issue. And
If I, Joseph, can I just pull you back to the
sure,
point you made around the generator of the electricity? So, what companies are kind of producing these things? Perhaps you could elaborate a little bit more about. So, I've built my data center in either an urban setting, as you mentioned, or in a more remote setting. What are the options available? I either do I kind of link it up to the grid, or do I need to kind of invest in additional generating power or capacity?
I thought you were going to ask me a hard question. That's a pretty easy question. Both. The answer is both. The answer is both. So what you're doing is you're linking up to the grid because all of a sudden you need a lot more power. But at the same time, if you can, and it depends on, you know, all about location. So if you've got enough space next door, then you can build a generation capacity to supply your data centers. And to build a generation facility of any kind, you need money, right? And the problem is that how do you go to the bank and say, well, can you please lend me money for this project, which is going to generate revenues in 1 year if it's renewables, or in 5-7 years if it's nuclear? It's a little bit, of a hard thing to swallow for a normal bank. So what happens is a lot of these major tech companies like Google, like Amazon, etc., what they'll do is that they'll sign a what's called corporate power purchasing agreement with the facility, even
Right.
before the facility is ready. So let's say, okay, I will take up, or I promise to buy, once you finish your facility, at least 50%, 70%, whatever number is, of the electricity capacity that you're going to be producing. So all of a sudden, you've got a contract, and you go to the bank and say, well, I got this contract. Can you lend me money? And then the bankability of the project is significantly higher, as you may guess. And very often, also, the interest rate that you're going to be paying on that loan is also different, right? Because it's all about
Because you've got a
risk.
guaranteed cash flow by a major
Correct.
company that has the ability to pay over the life of the contract.
Correct. So you've got again, going back to your question, where's the electricity coming from? It's the grid, and or, emphasis on and or, a generation facility which is not too far adjacent.
Which is built specifically for and dedicated to the smooth running of the data center. Is that right?
Mostly, yeah. Typically, I mean, the Amazons and the Googles of this world also don't want too much exposure, so they're not going to say, "I will buy 100% of your output. I will only buy a certain percentage, and the rest will go to somewhere else. We'll go to the grid, or we'll go to households in the neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera." But one incredible advantage you have by building a renewable energy facility, be solar, wind, or a combination of solar and wind, coupled with what we call energy storage, which is typically battery driven energy
Yeah.
storage, is that your cost is going to be stable. Because as we know from our experiences in the last just 5 years, because of the Ukraine war, fossil fuel prices are not necessarily stable. So by having a power from renewable energy source, your price is stable. It's very predictable.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Because you don't have
That's
the
kind of
fuel
slightly
input.
aside, but kind of saying, well, renewables will be quite a significant part of this additional generation capacity. I was quite surprised. I read the other day that I think the current situation in the UK is that now 33% of electricity generation is coming from wind. Is that right?
It's very high in the UK, as well in some other places in Europe. But the issue in the UK is the way that the prices of electricity are set, and that's quite complicated. Maybe we can take it up in a
Yeah, no,
different
absolutely.
in a different forum. But in this particular situation, when you're talking about infrastructure dedicated to data, and that infrastructure requiring X number of megawatts of assured output, then the best way, assuming that you've got the land available and the distribution lines or whatever it is, as far as I'm concerned, renewables, because you've got that stable cash flow. I mean, a data center cannot afford to always to pay, I don't know, 20 cents per kilowatt hour today and 40 cents tomorrow and 10 cents the next day. That kind of volatility is not what these data centers are about.
And does that same sense of certainty of price apply to, because there's obviously been a lot of discussion and commentary around, I think they're called mini nuclear generators or small nuclear generators, so not the type that kind of caused a certain amount of disquiet many years ago, but they seem to be more compact and ready to go for single facilities. Is that correct?
Right. So that's another one of good news, bad news kind of situation. The good news is that small modular reactors, especially the fourth generation, are very safe. So if it blows up, it's not going to kill a whole bunch of people or pollute the water and so on and so forth. The bad news is that the technology is not quite there yet. So we don't
Right.
have them live today. On a large scale, and also they need to get to a certain scale before you get the economic benefits, right? Because as you may be
Right.
aware, for example, for a lot of new technologies like solar, price of solar per unit of energy, so per kilowatt hour, has come down by something like 90% of the last 10 years or something. Well, depending on which market, et cetera, et cetera. But the cost curve has been absolutely tremendous. Same thing with wind. Now, today, as we speak, it's happening with batteries as well. So energy storage is very, very rapidly coming down. I mean, and this is an important point, because even 5 years ago, for you in your in your home, it didn't really make a lot of sense to have solar panels plus batteries, because the cost of the battery was too high.
Yeah.
Now, even in Europe, it's starting to appear where the cost is a lot more attractive, and it's still coming down. So that's what happens when you get economies of scale. With the small modular reactors, or SMRs, we're not there yet. So it's more of a 2030s story
Okay.
rather than a 2026 story.
And obviously, given your expertise and interest in the energy transition you've articulated in your podcast and your books, how would you sum up Europe, US, and China in terms of response to that energy demand? Obviously, accepting that China is still a growth economy, and so just by its very nature is adding even without AI. And how does that link in with some of the kind of Trump drill baby drill stuff?
Okay, I'm glad we have 6 or 7 hours to discuss that. No, just kidding. The short answer is that it is a transition, but as far as I'm concerned, we are already transitioning. I mean, people are already buying.
Give us, I guess, for each region, then perhaps kind of tell us the key takeaway.
Right.
Where do you see the one single kind of area that, or the best area in terms of meeting the energy demands in the UK?
Well, basically, it's clean energy. I mean, we all need to move to clean energy because, we got, as I mentioned earlier, we've got the stability in price, assuming that the electricity market and electricity system is appropriate, which it is not right now in the UK, and to a lesser extent is also not optimal in Europe. But I mean, the opportunity here is that, well, first of all, what we got to realize is that the world of fossil fuels is dying. It's dying of a slow death, true, but it is dying because it doesn't make any
Yeah,
sense. If you think, number one, if you think about the full life cycle of you getting your petrol in a petrol station, the actual the upstream drilling, the transportation of the oil, the refining of the oil, turning it into gasoline, et cetera, et cetera. It makes almost no sense. And by the way, it is a highly polluting activity as well. Number two, you've got a whole bunch of new jobs going to be created through the energy transition, infrastructure solutions, including AI related solutions, by the way. And you've got this stability in price, again, assuming that the electricity system is adequate. North America basically decided that we don't care about climate change, we don't care about the energy transitions. Not North America, excuse me, US, not Canada. The US was already a laggard relative to the king of the kings, which is China, in terms of clean energy. Europe is probably still behind China and some other Asian countries like Australia, for example, but it's growing still quite rapidly. And as long as we don't get unplugged, excuse the pun, by the Trump administration, which is now saying that they don't want to abide by European climate related rules, then Europe is still it's got a lot of momentum. The challenge in Europe, despite Brexit, I'm including the UK into Europe,
yeah,
is the fact that what we really need is a smoother and easier permitting cycle, because right now to get permits is absolutely hell. The structures for permitting are really obsolete. They haven't modernized. Say a medium size solar farm of 50 megawatts. It may take you just 6 months to build it, but it may take you like multiple years to get approvals. So it doesn't
wow,
make any sense whatsoever. I mean, we should still follow all the environmental permits and make sure that everything is kosher. But it just does not make any sense. In Germany, for example, they've had issues because wind turbines, right? They're pretty
yeah, of
massive
course.
and really, really long, and they have to be transported to where they're needed. But to transport something as large as you need permits. And if you're going through multiple towns, you're going to need multiple permits just to carry this particular wind turbines. I'm just being a little bit specific here, but permitting is really the issue that Europe is facing. And China is just going, 300 kilometers an hour. Now, there was a lot of controversy about China still building coal-fired power plants. And the reason they were doing that is because they still needed power. Coal-fired generation in China in the last 15 years, the contribution has gone down from something like 85% of total to under 50% now. And this is a country that is actually growing. So it's a pretty massive change.
Now, I saw it. I was in Chengdu only the other day, and the energy transition is there for all to see. And it always surprises me when I hear commentaries from Western countries saying, "What's the point in us complying with all these green initiatives if China's polluting the world?" But firsthand, I see a very different revolution taking place, and notwithstanding that, I think in some areas of the northeast where it's very difficult just to switch off the whole province and region. I see a massive commitment for whatever reason to transition, of which you obviously know so much about.
Absolutely. I think the opportunity here, especially if we're talking to young students, is really to get one's head around all of these different elements. Now, the difficulty is that when we're talking about a transition, we're really talking about an economic transition, right? We're talking about whole economies shifting. It's not just moving from fossil fuels to clean energy. It's well beyond that. One example is actually AI, because with the advent of AI, one of the many, many uses is AI can help you with energy efficiency. AI can help
Right.
modernizing the grid and making the grid more efficient. Because if you think about it right now, right, you go and build a, say, gas-fired power plant of 500 megawatts. What does that mean? It means that at a maximum, at one point of the day, sometime you will need almost 500 megawatts of power. But most of the time, you're not actually utilizing 500 megawatts because it's
Right.
8,760 hours in a year. You're not going to be, most of those hours, you're not going to be using that. Keeping it simple, I'm not an engineer, I'm a finance guy, but how do you balance all of that? And the balancing of systems, the demand management, et cetera, AI is extremely helpful. I'll give you one last example before we wrap up. One last example is something called vehicle to grid, which actually you do have in the UK. I think Octopus Energy is now providing such service. Whereas you have an electric car, right? The electric car has
Yeah.
batteries. But what percentage of your day are you actually driving that car? And I think on average is something like 80 to 90% of the time you're not driving the car. So it's just sitting there idle. But the batteries can be used. So if when the grid needs electricity, you can actually rely on your batteries, then you can just suck up your electricity and then give it back to you before you need your car. Now, all of that requires incredibly sophisticated IT systems, as you can imagine, because what happens is, Mark Coggins will enter into what's called a smart contract with the grid and say, okay, I promise not to use my car between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. So you guys can use the electricity when you need it. Just make sure you give it back to me. And they'll pay you something for it. So you're going to have a contract. Now, if we multiply that by hundreds of thousands or by millions and different contracts at different times, because, Joseph Jacobelli may want to use his car at 2 p.m., right?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, you're talking about something which is incredibly complicated. And having, AI will actually incredibly benefit this. And this is just one little example.
It's a really great example, and I'm sure full of complexity. But that whole area, I think, of synergistic benefits of AI needs energy and energy needs AI is a fascinating topic for a whole variety of reasons, and I think it's one that's going to evolve across multiple sectors. Look, Joseph, thank you very much for your insights and sharing them with us today. We are very eager to get you back across a whole multitude of areas, particularly in terms of the transition, and also given your background, the fact that you've done so much both in finance and then the broader sector, but also your linguistic abilities in 4 or 5 different languages and kind of getting your head around your new hometown of Lisbon and Portuguese, I'm sure that the students and the young investors would get some great insights in terms of decisions they might make around careers, either finance or energy and overseas, etc. So you're always welcome to come back and join the Invest Up Challenge. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Mark. It was a pleasure.
Terrific. Always a great pleasure to speak. Thanks, Joseph.
Thank you.
This podcast is for education, not investment advice. Always do your own research before you dive in.